palabras del actor y activista social Danny Glover.
Fiction is not only what identifies this American actor, but also his struggle as an activist for the respect and rights of African descendants. A task that does not remain in the US since it is thanks to Latin America and the Caribbean. Hello, this is from Caracas. I'm Ray Gomez, and I will be talking with the American actor and human rights activist Danny Glover, who's visiting Caracas these days. Hello, how are you?
Good to meet you, Ray.
Good to meet you too. And why is Danny Glover visiting Venezuela once again?
Well, I was invited to be a part of the commemoration for the 164th year of the abolition of slavery in Venezuela, which means that in 1854, the Venezuelans abolished slavery. I'm also here as the special Goodwill Ambassador for the Decade of African Descendants. And while both of those things seem to coincide with each other, it's
right.
always great to come back to Venezuela.
So you've been participating at the forum entitled African Descendants and Neoliberalism in Latin America and the Caribbean. What are the main topics that have been discussed, that have been an analysis during this forum?
Well, the main topics are three, which outline the Decade of African Descendants.
Yes.
One of recognition, justice, and development. Those are the three areas of concern and three areas that we focus on. There were more than 200 million African descendants in this hemisphere alone, in the northern and southern hemisphere, of which over 100 million of them live in Brazil. So this conversation, which is an ongoing conversation post the Durban Conference on racism and xenophobia in 2001. It's a dynamic that's been happening within the region. In fact, my first meeting here in Brazil, my first time to Venezuela to meet President Chavez was here a conversation about African descendants, conversation about Haiti. The first thing we talked about was the Haiti and about African descendants. And he noted that in the 1999 Constitution, that while they're taking care of women, indigenous people, that African descendants were not on the table for that discussion. And he began—
When you analyze, are you saying that President Chavez was a pioneer making real a policy in order to protect African descendants in Venezuela?
Absolutely, and it was really action, the action that he took after the discussion. And I have to thank my great friend Chucho Garcia, who was at the time it was head of the Afro-Venezuelan network here, and for bringing us here, and while at the same time celebrating Dr. King's birthday in January of 2004, began to have concrete discussions about the plight of African descendants.
So, by the way, President Chavez has signed in 2012 a law in order to protect the African descendant community in this country. And nowadays, I've read that within the Constituent Assembly, there is another law which has been prepared in order to reinforce the protection to this community in Venezuela. So how do you see this?
Well, that's a great thing. I mean, that specifically we begin to address the issues of African descendants, but it's more than just decrees in itself. But what's so, I think, special about Venezuela is the collaboration between citizens, ordinary citizens, and governance in a participatory democracy.
It's the protection of the African descendants, policy of state, of government in Venezuela?
Well, it certainly is. You know, it's been an ongoing discussion. It doesn't take just one action. It's the continuum of actions that are taken over a period of time. And what I've seen with the participation of Afro-descendants and all citizens within Venezuela, an opportunity to raise the issues around justice, raise the issues around development concerning African descendants. And I think that's where that becomes a very important aspect of, I think, what has happened since I've been visiting Venezuela over 14 years. I was in Barlovento last in 2012, and I saw the development. And I saw that the enormous pride that men and women and families had within the community as they take actions on their own behalf as citizens and everything. And I think it's important to emphasize the fact that these are ordinary citizens who believe that their voice matters, that their voice matters within the framework of their lives and changing their lives, you know. And you can see that in so many ways: the building of housing in Barlovento, the number of units, the decree or the plan and activation around building homes and housing. You know, there's a shortage of housing for all people in the world, and certainly to take that on as a part of a national objective is very important.
And what's happening in the rest of the region, the Caribbean, or Latin America?
Well, I think one of the things...
What do people who come to Venezuela in order to think on this say?
Well, I think there's so many different things that have happened over the course of time. Certainly since '99, the relationships with ALBA, you have initiatives like ALAC, you know, issues like Petro-Carib, which is specifically for the Caribbean nations. So there's a new humanity within foreign policy that's being developed and orchestrated, you know, and I think a lot of that has certainly been the role that Venezuela has played, the role that Brazil has played, and the role of finding a common unity within the region itself.
Is this situation similar to the one the African descendants in the United States of America are living?
Well, I think you're comparing apples and oranges, you know. Certainly we can look at the history of African Americans in the United States, and we look at the periods post the abolition of slavery, the long periods of Jim Crow, and another form of servitude that occurred, and then the civil rights movements. But all within that framework, within that period of time, African Americans made enormous contributions to the history and the texture, not only cultural texture, but just the texture of the United States and as a people. So I think when we think about their inclusiveness within this whole process, their building and sustaining of their own institutions, from their colleges they build and sustain the major institutions of learning, the major institutions of thinking, the national healthcare service organization formed by African Americans in 1900. There are different ways of progress that have occurred. So it's a different situation when you think about that, and think about the history of Latin America specifically, and each of them has their own particular history. Colombia has this particular history, and as we know, and we know that in Colombia, the most grievously affected by the civil war between the FARC, were African descendants. More than out of the 4 million internally displaced people during that period, over half of them were African descendants. And African descendant population of Colombia is only about 16%. So these are dynamics that happen. They're different in Brazil, which has almost over 100 million people who are self-claimed African, proclaim themselves to be African descendants. So these are different dynamics from Argentina to Bolivia to Ecuador to right here in Venezuela. But the idea that we put the issue of African descendants on the map right there, and talk specifically about this period as designated from 2014, January 1st, 2015, to December 31st, 2024, as the decade for African descendants. And to use this as an opportunity to find ways in which governance, as long as ordinary citizens and civil society, play in the role of not simply as a recognition of the contributions of African descendants, recognition of their plight, but also justice. Justice is key to that, and development. What are the political projects? What are the activities that we take on now, in order to remedy those facts, or in sense eliminate some of those factors? You know, Venezuela has done that. You know, in the course of not simply just African descendants, but all citizens here. They've reduced poverty, severe poverty, significantly. In here, they begin to set up various other cooperatives in way in which people had control over with the food themselves and building their own sense of sustainability. Those are the kind of things that I think are actions that have been taken here, often gone unrecognized. Actions that are taken here that certainly have met the goals, have performed in attempting to meet the goals of this decade of African descendants. And not only decade of African descendants, the millennial goals.
Right.
The United Nations laid out millennial goals, you know, for the whole world in terms of poverty, you know. And we know significantly that so much has happened, so much is happening in the world with conflict, the fact that the refugees is the greatest refugee crisis since the end of World War II.
Within those crises, the African descendants have the most affected.
And we can see what's happening in Africa. This is an important moment. This is an important moment where we develop a new transformative humanity. What is the world? The World Social Forum, which was just held in Bahia, Salvador this year. What is the world going to look like? What is the world going to look like for us as 7 billion human beings? What is it going to look like for the planet itself? These are the kind of things that I think are essential, and right here, as we've witnessed on many occasions in this region, have been the region that's pushed forward the most imaginative, most constructive initiatives to meet those goals.
Apart from the Venezuelan government, are the rest of governments in the world aware of what you are saying?
Well, I had a wonderful visit to Honduras and met with people from the Granizo community, yes. The first mayor of a city, La Ceiba, in Honduras, first African descendant mayor was elected, a city over 200,000 people was elected mayor. We saw that, had conversation. I was in Costa Rica and Limon and talked with, and in Limon where the port where 80% of Costa Rica's exports go through that port. You know, it is run by an African descended woman, and not only does she run that, they have a larger plan in terms of development around not simply Limon itself, but development around the region. In fact, I met with at least 5 or 6 mayors from different small communities around Limon. You know, the next month, April 1st, they will have the election and the possibility of an Afro-descended woman, Desi Campbell, to be elected as the vice president of Costa Rica. So that the conversation is an inclusive conversation. I'm sure there are representatives here from Costa Rica, representatives from Honduras and other places in Central America and the region. Those are the things, the concrete actions that are taking in communities. You know, it is important that we find a nexus between governance, participatory democracy, and citizens. It's an important element of this. And maybe what we will do, we can build a participatory, more functional participatory relationship between all those.
So you think we should begin since the very basis in order to get to the higher government, in order to change the minds of, in order to change the policies, such as in the United States, for instance?
Well, I mean, you have the United States now. Reverend Barber, Bishop Barber, is reigniting and reinitiating the Poor People's March. Dr. King, when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, was in the midst of organizing the Poor People's March, which included not simply African Americans, but Asians, Latinos, and poor white Americans as well. So I think on the one hand, those are the kind of initiatives that can feed into the need for what we're talking about in this particular hemisphere. So you have the Poor People's March, you have initiatives taken here, the decree, the abolition of slavery, and other initiatives that are taking place in the region. Finding a common thread between us, we're all of us meeting, conversing, having discussions, and finding different ways in which we collaborate with each other is an important part of this process.
Analysts and activists are saying that education must come first. This is a problem in education. If we change the way of learning what really happens in the world, we could make possible that people like, for instance, Condoleezza Rice, we don't have politicians like those African descendants in a government or in the United States administration. Is that right? Should we work more on education in order to change the minds?
Well, I think the process of education is essential.
What kind of education do we need?
The process of education is key in terms of information. You know, democracy doesn't work without people who are knowledgeable about the issues and are able to, and able to discuss and also pontificate on the issues, whatever it is. But I think more than education is civic engagement. That's the most important. You don't have to be. You don't have to be. You don't have to, like Martin Luther King often said, you don't have to have a PhD in order to serve.
Right.
In order to serve, and I mean when I say serve, become active citizens. Education is a part of that. The ability to read is a part of that, and certainly that is critical to it. But also, what do we mean by development? What do we mean by human development? Education is one link to that. What do we mean by human cultural development? That's a part of it too. And what do we mean by having work that enhances us as human beings? Right. So how do we create jobs that are not simply just jobs that we manipulate our time during an 8-hour period or whatever the period we work are, but how do we create work that sustains us and the character of who we are as human beings, and build a relationship, a community around our humanity. That's what the education we have to talk about. Some of the most highly trained people who have been educated in the most the great institutions in the country, in my country, man, have done some of the most grievous and atrocious things when they put them in public service. So education itself is a part of it, but what comes from here? What comes from us? How do we connect with each other? That's the kind of that's the new kind. How do we end war? Out of all the education that we're saying we have Syria right now. We have the conflict. We had what happened in Afghanistan, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Yemen. We're having all those things with all these educated minds right here.
All right.
These are not educated minds. What are the instruments that we need now? How do those instruments now apply to creating the kind of communities of respect, the kind of communities of sovereignty, the kind of communities that engage citizens as real citizens in what happens in their country?
And within the community of families.
And family.
What should be the main function of families and the main role of the family in this topic?
Well, that whole idea of family is going through its own transformation, you know. The issues around and the questions that people have around what does the family constitute now, you know, in the larger context of the family, you know. We have to embrace all concepts of what we mean by family in a sense, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's those kind of families that are formed out of the loss or of building family is critical, but the idea of family has to take on a larger meaning.
Right.
Now, larger than essentially the framework in which we place families before.
Back to Venezuela. You've been visiting Venezuela many times, but the media is used to saying that there is a dictatorship in Venezuela. What do you think of it?
Well, I've been to no less than four elections here in Venezuela. I was here when the Carter Institution came here and proclaimed the Venezuelan election the best election ever in history.
Really?
Yes. It's the most transparent.
Why?
Because there were various other ways in which it allowed, it supported the integrity of people's vote. People came out, almost 80% of the population came out to vote. So there was great participation in it. The ways in which they documented who voted, how you voted, and other ways in which were superior to any other way that that I've ever seen. Superior to any other way I ever seen. And where the voice of the people was defined, the voice of the people was heard and recognized. You know, if countries have failed to recognize that, then certainly the Venezuelans have done everything that they could to show that they are capable of carrying out elections, and they're capable of probably having the greatest participatory democracy, you know, in this hemisphere.
This is an electoral year. What do you think it could happen?
Well, I'm not an expert on that. You know, I know that.
But many people are listening to your thoughts.
Well, I think that the Venezuelan people, as always, would use the ballot box as a place where they feel that they want to elect the person that they want to elect, that they see that will help them and help this nation move forward. And I believe they have the confidence in themselves, and I believe they have the confidence in their systems, the system of transparency to be able to carry out an election and to be able to do that as they've done in the past. And certainly make the choices that they feel that are necessary in order to move the Venezuela forward.
On Danny Glover, are we going to see Danny Glover participating, playing a new role in a new film soon?
That's to be determined.
Yeah, why?
Well, there's a couple of projects that are coming out that I have and I'm proud of, and they'll be out this year. I'll have a couple of projects to come out this year.
Danny, thank you very much for this interview to tell us we're in English.
Thank you very much. All right then. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you. This is from Caracas. I'm Ray Gomez. Thank you very much.